Tara Lal, AFSM, is a professional firefighter and peer support officer with Fire Rescue New South Wales. She's also a PhD candidate at the University of New England and was awarded the inaugural Australian Rotary Health Scholarship for research into mental health of emergency service workers in 2018. Her research focuses on understanding the impact of suicide on firefighters. She is also the internationally published author of Standing on My Brother's Shoulders, Making Peace with Grief and Suicide. Her mission is to use the voice of lived experience in her research to effect meaningful change at individual, organisational and community levels. Tara Lal.
Well, thank you, James. So in all honesty, preparing this talk was hard. I wanted it to be perfect, and I built this story in my head that I was going to deliver this incredible keynote with meaning and resonance. And so I busily applied pressure on myself. And then I ended up in hospital. And no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get it to work. But then I realised that the very value of the voice of lived experience lies in its authenticity, in its humanness, in what it tells us about our common humanity. It cannot be categorised, controlled, defined, or diagnosed. For human experience is complex and messy. It is tangled and non-linear, but it is also true. So instead of the perfect speech, you will get the real one, the authentic wisdom of the voice of lived experience, the one you and I and the organisations that we work for need to listen more deeply to. I was a final year physiotherapy student back in 1999 at Sydney University, and I was attending a tutorial on clinical reasoning. And it was supposed to be teaching us how we could define what the presenting problem was and then prescribe the right treatment accordingly. And I only remember these words from my tutor. And he said, "Tara, if you listen hard enough, they'll tell you the answer." The fact that the tutor was disarmingly attractive probably did also help his words stick. But I don't think that I had any idea at the time of the wisdom of his words and his message. Our biomedical, scientific, logic-driven cause and effect approach to well-being takes a top-down perspective. The nature of our culture, our organisations, our medical systems, and our approach to health is that we look to experts for the answers to complex human problems. We categorise, diagnose, pathologise and define. And don't get me wrong, this approach has brought us so far and helped so many to recover from disease and illness. But this way of approaching health and wellbeing doesn't give us the full picture. As you may know, I am currently studying for a PhD researching the impact of suicide on firefighters. As Anne, one of the participants in my PhD, said when talking about her experience of losing her brother to suicide, "It's like three sides to a square. Where's the other side?" It is the voices of those frontline workers and their family members with lived and living experience of distress, of struggle, of illness, suicide, growth, and of recovery that hold the key to transforming our approach to wellbeing. Perhaps the most progressive shift towards recognising the value of the lived experience voice has been in the field of suicide prevention. The 2020 Compassion First report was founded on hearing the voices of thousands of people with lived experience of suicidal behaviour and informed Australia's approach to suicide prevention. It called for a seismic paradigm shift. To quote Christine Morgan, the National Suicide Prevention Advisor, "We have no option but to position lived experience knowledge at the forefront of research, policy and practice. Without it, our reforms and service improvements will fall short of what people need and what people deserve. We, as organisations at the front line, would do well to heed this wisdom and advice. What would it look like if we turned our traditional biomedical, quantitatively driven approach to wellbeing upside down? If we dared to take a different perspective, to work from the ground up and from the inside out? A truly integrated approach to wellbeing means respecting and hearing every voice equally. Not just our leaders, our researchers, our managers, our clinicians, and academics. It means we listen and act upon the voices of those with lived experience of distress and the struggle, and of their family members. It means hearing and embracing the messiness and complexity for the insight that it gives us, and acknowledging and holding our own discomfort in doing so. For we are the experts of our own lives. We have wisdom beyond what we know. Every single one of us holds the answers to our needs. What we must do as frontline organisations is find a way of tapping into this wisdom and knowledge. And we can do this in 3 ways. We have to ask difficult questions of ourselves and of our organisations, because the key to transformation lies in the questions we ask and to whom we ask them. We have to respect, empower and give voice to those whose stories have been marginalised, silenced, disempowered or not heard. We have to listen deeply with compassionate curiosity to the stories we hear and act upon them by bringing together people with lived experience, academics, clinicians and policymakers to jointly make decisions informed by each other's expertise using genuine co-design processes. Only when we take these 3 steps can we effect meaningful change and truly construct an integrated approach to wellbeing at an individual, organisational and cultural level. Over the next 20 minutes, I will take you on a journey from trauma and silencing towards growth and empowerment through the voice of lived experience. To do so, I want to share something of my own life story and my own tangled and convoluted journey. With the benefit of hindsight and deep reflection, I now realise how much of it was defined by not having a voice and the sense of disempowerment and disconnection that ensued. On the 21st of November 1988, when I was 17 years old, I went to sleep at home in London like any other night. And I was preparing to sit a university entry exam the next day. It was the middle of the night and I vaguely remember hearing the phone ringing that woke me from my slumber. And I wondered vaguely who would be calling at this time. And then I heard my father's heavy footsteps trudging up the stairs. He knocked at my door. "Yes, Dad," I said. "It's Adam, my beloved elder brother. He's had an accident, which we later knew to be a fatal suicide attempt." "I have to go to the hospital," he said, fumbling for words. A million questions went through my head. What's happening? Is he okay? "I want to come with you," I said to my father. "No," he said. "You stay here, go to school in the morning and sit the exam." So I lay on my own through the night. The clock ticked. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I wanted to be with Adam. What if he needed me and I wasn't there? Morning came and a neighbour arrived telling me to go to school, to wait for my sister. Why won't anyone tell me anything? I thought. Why won't they listen to me? I screamed silently. I knew that in that moment I wanted and needed to be with my brother. But no one heard me. No one asked me what I needed. I had no sense of control, and it broke me, a beautiful piece of pottery shattered into pieces on the floor. That experience, one of the most traumatic of my life, was the beginning of a long-held belief that I had to swallow my voice and my needs. It resonated so strongly when I heard Jamie, one of the firefighters who participated in my research, say, "Sometimes no one sees you," when he described the impact of silencing his own experiences of his father's suicide 30 years ago. If we don't empower and hear the voices of our most vulnerable people, we deny their stories, we augment trauma, we feed illness, injustice and betrayal, and we fail to listen to learn from the voices of lived experience. We fail to see the richness of the bigger picture. It is through listening deeply, compassionately, and attentively that people feel seen, heard, valued, and cared for. We all need that. So how can we transform our approach to wellbeing through hearing the voices of our frontline workers and their families with lived and living experience of distress, struggle, illness, trauma, and suicide? Research is such an important part of us learning from and about our experiences and how to better support people. But the type of research is really important. To date, much of our policy and practice has been based on a biomedical model of research that is built on answering surveys, ticking boxes, and short answer replies. This more quantitatively driven research has been incredibly valuable, but it doesn't tell us how we, as frontline workers, experience events within the context of our personal and professional lives. Qualitative research offers a different way of capturing and understanding people's experiences. It is the type of research that listens much more deeply to the personal stories that people tell. It is the type of research that we need to do more of and pay more attention to. Because behind every statistic is a person, a journey, and a story. In order to transform our approach to wellbeing, we must give equal weight to quantitative and qualitative research practices that are based on the stories and voices of lived and living experience. Only when we have parity can we truly benefit from the wisdom that comes from both. If we position the knowledge from lived experience at the forefront of research, policy, and practice, we communicate the complexities and multidimensionality of the problems that we face. And we allow the voices of those we speak with to guide us towards the questions that we need to ask. My own PhD research involved hearing the stories of 20 firefighters. The only thing that they had in common was that they had some experience of exposure to suicide. Some had only personal experience, losing a family member or a close friend, experiences that they brought into their role as firefighters. Some only had occupational exposure to suicide, attending incidents, and some had lost a colleague. Many had a combination of all of these experiences. The research question that I asked was intentionally broad. It was, how do firefighters experience exposure to suicide in their personal and professional lives? By hearing their deeply personal, often painful stories, I dived deep into trying to understand what it was that they were telling me. They spoke sometimes for up to 2.5 hours, and I simply listened deeply, over and over, iteratively trying to resonate with what it was that they were telling me. I let them take their story wherever they wanted to take it. And what I heard was the complex matrix within which their experiences were lived. They spoke not just of suicide, but of their relationships, their mental health, of organisational injustice and betrayal, of identity and of childhood trauma and abuse. They spoke almost universally of an accumulation of experiences throughout their lives, both personally and professionally, that may or may not have led to a diagnosis or an unravelling. One of my participants, Will, spoke about how he felt after 40 years in the job and how it played out in his life, relationally and emotionally. These were Will's words. Each of these incidents is a bit like getting a splinter. And if you get a little splinter in your thumb, sometimes you just can't get it out. So you ignore it, and over time, it goes away. I've been collecting those splinters for 40 years, one splinter at a time for 40 years. I'm carrying a fair lump of timber by now, and it gets in the way. It's awkward to deal with. It's heavy to carry. You know, sometimes it festers and makes me sore. People say you get used to it. No, you don't get used to it. It still leaves a mark. You get used to working around that mark so that you remain functional, but I don't think you're necessarily well. And that's certainly how I feel at the moment. Later, he said, I was in the hallway at home and I was screaming at my missus. And I was stuffed if I could work out why. We were arguing over something as important as the colour of the tea towels. And I was screaming at her, and I was looking at her, this woman who I've loved for over 40 years, and I was abusing her because I didn't know why. And then I thought, the reason I'm doing this is because of all this other crap that's been piling up on me for as long as I've been in the fire brigade. Our current biomedical approach to trying to understand experience means that we miss vital and invaluable learnings about the broader matrix and context within which we live and work, the impact on our relationships, and what the needs of families are. What if we actively sought out not only our own voices as frontline workers, but the voices of our family members, partners and spouses, so that we could understand their needs, so that we could understand how Will's experiences were manifesting in the relationship, because we know that our relational health lies at the very core of our well-being. The 2020 Compassion First report mapped different journeys that led to suicidal crisis and identified numerous opportunities or touch points along people's journeys to provide support and assist people before they reach crisis point. Imagine if along the way at each splinter point, Will had been able to talk. If someone had asked more with compassionate curiosity about what those splinters felt like, what made some fester and others not. What if those splinters became an opportunity, a touch point to offer support, so that he didn't end up arguing with his wife over the colour of the tea towels? As Will said at the end of my interview with him, I think keeping stuff bottled up hurts, and it just builds an internal pressure that is going to find a way out. And whether that's screaming at the wife or talking quietly to you, I think talking quietly to you is probably better. I think that's good, helping identify the blips along the road that have helped me find the splinter. Another thing Will spoke of were the organisational stresses that left him with a sense of betrayal and injustice. Recent research demonstrates how occupational stresses related to leadership styles, organisational engagement, stigma and social environment have as much, if not greater, impact on mental health and wellbeing as exposure to potentially traumatic events. I asked Simon, one of the firefighters who took part in my research, if he felt valued by the organisation. He was also a peer support worker with Fire and Rescue. He laughed. Oh no, not at all, definitely not. So I asked him, what would it take for you to feel valued? Well, for them to ask that exact question for a start would be one thing. To actually show that you care. To be supported, I suppose, in some ways, and I don't know, maybe not feel like such an inconvenience to them. I think as far as we're an inconvenience, nothing to do with money. I'm quite happy with what I'm getting paid for what I do, for sure. But to actually feel valued as a person for what you do, money can't really buy that. So I don't think it's a financial thing at all. I mean, you could pay me more money and I'd probably still feel the same way. We know that employees' perceptions of being valued directly impacts workplace orientation, performance, and well-being. As Matt, another participant in my research, said, as a person, everyone wants to be validated, and just being heard validates what my experience was or has been. So what would it look like if, instead of sending surveys, we were to ask our people what they need to feel valued, face to face, and listened deeply, with compassion to their answers? Because as Shane, another of the participants in my research, said, if you just sent me a survey, there's things I know I probably wouldn't have delved into. It just seemed to go that way. It's probably educated me. You've probably helped me more than you'll ever know. Just to have that awareness of things on my journey, with my life. What if we actively sought out the voices of those who have experienced injustice or betrayal or embitterment? I call on us all to not just push those voices aside as an inconvenience or because it's too hard or too emotional. In order to be proactive in early intervention, we have to understand the historical, social, cultural, and organisational context of people's stories and their journeys, so that we can identify touch points along their journeys before they reach crisis point. Only then can we offer timely, effective, person-centred support that meets the needs of our people. Imagine if we were to approach well-being from a humanitarian perspective, not a medical one. My own recent experiences have led me to an even deeper understanding of the complex way in which trauma violates our sense of coherence in the world and can weave its way into the tapestry of our lives. Unexpectedly and ostensibly without warning, I found myself in hospital a few weeks ago. I did not have a life-threatening illness. I was on IV antibiotics to treat an infection. Yet I felt as if my world, my very being, was unravelling. I had never spent time in hospital, not since I sat with my mother as a 13-year-old watching her die, desperate for her not to leave me. And then 4 years later, when I sat next to my brother as he lay dying, desperate once again to hold on to his beating heart. It is important to acknowledge that I am now the age that my mother was when she died, 51. As I lay there in hospital with a central line, it felt as if I was reliving my mother's experience of chemotherapy. I felt the embodied experience of trauma in every cell, every organ, and every tissue of my body. My body felt twisted and contorted, like it was trying to rid itself of something. And my experience aligns with evidence that speaks of how we hold trauma, not just in our heads, but in our bodies and in our hearts. Yet organisationally, do we acknowledge this aspect of trauma or distress? Medicine could not explain or treat my experiences. I do not have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I didn't feel depressed or even anxious in a clinical sense. I had felt an intangible sense of dis-ease over the prior 6 months that I wasn't able to define. I had a few jobs at work that unsettled me. They weren't overly traumatic in nature. In fact, it was the ostensibly benign ones that rocked me the most. I inhaled some toxic smoke and I could feel my mother's presence. Was the toxic smoke going to lead to my death at the same age as my mother had died? I started to get tinnitus in my left ear, like the universe was trying to tell me something, and I had trouble sleeping. I felt a building sense of embitterment, injustice, and betrayal within the organisation that I couldn't pinpoint or define. What I was experiencing didn't fit into any clinical diagnosis. It is these types of lived experiences that we need to pay attention to listen to, and to learn from. Because all of our experience sits within a complex historical, social, cultural matrix that cannot be differentiated from who we are as frontline workers. In my late 30s, my childhood experiences led me on my own therapeutic journey. Through many years of work and commitment to the therapeutic process, I grew to understand how the emotional experiences of my life live within me. I invite you all to explore your own emotional worlds with compassion and therapeutic guidance. During this time, I also turned to writing, and I wrote my entire life story down like no one was ever going to read it. This process of writing gave me a voice and allowed me to integrate all of my experiences. It allowed me to re-script and make sense of my life so that it and I became whole again. As I said to a friend a few months ago, I used to feel broken and now I don't. It was the creation of a coherent life narrative that enabled me to feel unbroken, to feel whole, and to live my truth. I have peeled back many layers over time, but it is only now in these last few weeks and months that I have been able to access perhaps the most deeply held layer, the embodied experience of trauma, that has felt to me to be on a cellular and organic level. What I needed during this time was a spiritual guide, for want of a better term, that could help me hold space for my resurgent grief and trauma and acknowledge my own unique experiences that cannot be made sense of through logic or thought. I needed only for someone to be with me that could resonate on a deeply felt level, to hold and nurture and support me to find my own way through and to make my own meaning from my experiences through my very personal journey to find connectedness and deeper consciousness. Whilst these are personal experiences, they live in me as a professional firefighter and touch me in my work as a first responder. And this is true for every single one of us. I tell this story because it speaks to the value of lived experience in helping us to see the problem from a richly textured, more multidimensional perspective. It helps us to see how and why we need a truly integrated approach to wellbeing that respects our biological, social, cultural, relational, psychological, and spiritual health. We have to foster the collective courage to effect meaningful change through a seismic shift in our thinking and in our organisational narrative around mental ill health, disease, and wellbeing. To use the words of M. Scott Peck, we need to have the courage to take the road less travelled. We have to turn things upside down so we can work from the ground up by privileging and respecting the voices of those with lived experience of distress, of illness and suicide, of organisational injustice and moral betrayal, of bullying and harassment and workplace conflict, and of recovery and growth. A truly integrated approach to wellbeing must be based on equality and respect for every voice. We must actively seek to hear the voices of those who are most vulnerable, those that are disempowered, marginalised or silenced, and we must listen deeply with compassionate curiosity to what it is that they are saying. We must move from a biomedical to a humanitarian and relational approach that emanates from a place of compassion. We must take a whole of organisation and whole of community approach if we are to effectively support our people. We must heed the World Health Organization advice, which now says the inclusion of lived experience is crucial in the development of effective strategies and practices and ensures the needs of people requiring support are met. We must look to organisations outside of our own fields, like Roses in the Ocean, who are leading the way in engaging, developing and integrating the voice of lived experience to inform inclusive culture change. We must place the lived experience voice at the forefront of everything we do and integrate it into every step of the design, development, implementation and evaluation of our policies, programs and practices. This lies at the heart of the genuine co-creation of new knowledge and practice. But let's not wait for policies and procedures to tell us that this is what we should do. Each and every one of us can start to ask more difficult questions of ourselves and listen more deeply to our own lived experience and to the lived experiences of those in our personal and, so importantly, also those in our professional worlds right now. Only then will we ensure our needs as frontline workers are met. I leave you with this. The word integrate comes from the Latin word integrare, to make whole, to renew, to repair. Kintsukuroi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold and understanding that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. Transforming our approach to well-being means having the courage to take a different perspective, to pick up the pieces so that we can renew, repair, and make whole again. It is the voices of those with lived and living experience that are the very essence of Kintsukuroi. We just need to listen and they will tell us the answer. Thank you.